What's up, everyone? Welcome to today's video. Welcome to the Video Game Fight School channel. Thank you very much for tuning in. Gotham Knights developers, some of their systems that they've been able to work on and how they've been able to achieve them, in my opinion, I think provides them the groundwork and the capability to make whichever video game they intend to make. They are all experienced folk. They've worked in other studios for the most part, people who shipped Gotham Knights. They just happen to have a task in front of them that I think was probably one of the much more interesting ones to put together. They had the task of making a game that had a multiplayer focus, a game that could serve both console generations. They could not get the PS4 version working in an acceptable state. I think if the game was fully single player, we would have seen a PlayStation 4 and Xbox One version. But once you added that multiplayer aspect, the co-op, I think that really did cause, in my opinion, a huge rift in the technological, capabilities available. So they decided to go with the new generation consoles and making your co-op untethered in a way where you still had an offline game, not using an external offline mode or online mode anyways, or separating the offline and the online modes like the way Heroic Assault is compared to the main game. I think that really did cause a dent in the performance. So the 30 FPS you're seeing on console, in my opinion, I think is as a result of the fact that if somebody were to join your session, I don't necessarily think the consoles would have been able to maintain a stable 60 FPS in that, paradigm. I'll talk a little bit about why I say so, and we'll kind of dive into a little bit more stuff about their combat, why I think they have the capabilities to be able to make, say, another DC superhero game or even a Superman game. Now, let's talk about the frame rates, because before I go into the combat, people may talk about the performance and say, oh, what's up with the performance and so on and so forth. Well, when you consider the way Gotham Knights is designed and developed as a video game, the untethered co-op is being used in context of a third-person action game, in a sense, where all your animations are firing and your camera is doing the work of making sure it sees all of that. Then you have your replication systems that make sure that you and whoever you're playing with are seeing the same thing. So when somebody's health has gone down, you get to see it. Or when they're about to do a takedown, maybe if you try to hit them, you're not going to get into that because that takedown is taken over by somebody else on the server. However, when you think about the way these systems are done in many other games, they allow for these, co-op systems to allow for the game to either be run fully online, just the way like Division runs fully online, the way that they wanted, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League to run fully online, and so on and so forth. But if you have a game that you have some offline aspects to the game, and then you want some of those things to run, with very limited use of your servers, then you have to task your machine to get the job done. Now, if you think about the way, the game runs at 30 FPS on console, I think any machine that is close to the console side is also running below 60 FPS. And I say I think because I have a laptop that I can compare to a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X. I mean, it's not the best comparison, but it's an RTX 2060 laptop. I have a 2070 laptop as well. They behave similar. They play games with similar quality. The best frame rate I can get for Gotham Knights on that device is about 55 FPS. Whenever I jump into Heroic Assault, it's about 40 something FPS when I'm playing with other people. So in a co-op session, I get more than 30 FPS, even when everything is, cooled off and I'm running turbo. The machine's not overheating. It's a Predator. Those things are built very well. It still is not giving me 60 FPS. This helps me to kind of maybe interpolate in a very loose sense that if this were to run on one of these consoles, you still would not be able to get that 60 FPS mark unless you're using a much more powerful device. When I'm playing the game on, say, a 1080 Ti, not even, what I would even call a big, huge leap when it comes to some technological advantages, but a 1080 Ti is a beast, then you're able to get that 60 FPS without any problems. When you go into the RTX 40 series and so on and so forth, you can get 60 FPS throughout this Heroic Assault with no problem. You can get more than that even if you actually tune your computer well. So machines start to actually provide much more capabilities the more, powerful they are with Gotham Knights, and the consoles or even low-end gaming PCs are just not there to handle the game the way the game was designed. So even though people may say console is playing at 30 FPS, we want 60 FPS, low-end computers are not even playing Gotham Knights at 60 FPS. This is a reality that everybody has to actually dive into. Console gamers think that most console gamers today, they think that every game can play at 60, should be able to play at 60 FPS on their machine. Whereas in the PC world, we've been used to dealing with you being able to play a game as much as your machine can actually carry the performance. So if your machine is not able to carry the full 60 FPS or more than 60 FPS, that is based on the power of your machine and what it can deliver. And I think the consoles have reached the point where, for the most part, with the ambition of these new games, the machines are only going to be able to carry so much. I think they could have probably had a middle ground by giving a 45 FPS performance option. This might have helped, or they could have separated every online co-op aspect of the game to a whole different layer. Example being, the entire Gotham Knights base game should have been a full-fledged experience by itself. No co-op with that. That would have given you a 60 FPS run for your consoles and most of your PCs alike. And then anything else like Heroic Assault should have been the external server thing, where everybody goes into an external server, all that world is loaded, the AI and everything is loaded on their servers. All you're doing is your machine is running your player and your animations and a few things. That would have given us exactly what it is that we wanted. Whew, took me about 6 minutes to talk about all that, but those are just my, thoughts about all of this stuff. But again, you got to work with what you get. What if Warner Brothers was like, we're not paying for all the servers, deal with it, and they just had to basically do what they wanted? We don't know how the conclusions were made in all of that. In seeing that these were the limitations, I think that if they were to be moving into another video game, there will be a lot that's going to be considered as, time moves on. Because if they decide they want to move their game to a full online server aspect, or they want to depend more on the servers, which are much more powerful computers with better computing capabilities, the audiences and the communities are not really fond of that. Look at the way Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League got treated. It got pushed back to the developers after people realized and found out that, oh, the game is going to be an online only game. Usually companies would do that because of performance as a way to be able to bridge that gap. But I guess that was not something that people wanted to accept, seeing that live service games, they do go out of style for the most part. Some live service games have their offline mode. They have some, story beats and things that you can still play. But if you make your game fully 100% online, players are not really fond of that. And so there has to be, in my opinion, what I think is the emphasis on the single player games. And then if they want an offline or online mode, they can go ahead and develop something like that. Ghost of Tsushima did something like that with Ghost Legends, where they created an extra, online mode that everybody could go on to co-op. That was actually pretty cool. Far Cry is limited because they only want to, give you 2 players to play with in one specific setting. You can't really do much more than 2. So anything else would probably be better for them to do offline modes where you can have more players and so on and so forth. So with the technical and the performance side, I still believe that the solutions to the problems are actually very interesting as to how developers go about it. Every game is very different. These are chess pieces or puzzles that devs have to basically put together the solutions and the answers. So if you're thinking about performance, thinking about, oh, well, if they can't get a game to run at this performance, then this disqualifies them. I'd say to you that you have to pretty much look very carefully at the systems, the mechanics, the machines. That's basically the computers, the games, in regard to how they work on the consoles and how the games are designed, for you to be able to conclude that. Because I see a lot of people say, Gotham Knights doesn't even have 60 FPS. That's not true. It has a 60 FPS mode on much more powerful machines. So unless you actually are in a position where you want to admit that machines will have different capabilities and different limitations based on the different games, then you're probably going to be in the same boat where you continue to reiterate this without looking at the different nuances. Because yes, another game can I know a very good example. People will cite Red Dead Redemption. They'll be like, Red Dead Redemption 2 is a big open world, and that game even runs at so-and-so FPS on so-and-so console. But that game is developed differently from Gotham Knights. You can't jump into Red Dead Redemption, your friend's session of the game, unless you guys go to Red Dead Redemption Online, where it's a whole different setup in order for you to be able to play the game together in a co-op setting. So these are things that you kind of have to keep looking at whenever you're making these judgment calls. And I think from that perspective, the Gotham Knights developers were able to resolve and find a middle ground. Not the middle ground that everybody liked, but still a middle ground that delivered the game. And now you're in a position where you actually do have access to that game, and it's not locked behind some online server. Now, when it comes to combat, how were they able to implement their combat systems that makes me think that there is, in my opinion anyways, confidence that can be had in the fact that they're going to be able to do a Superman game very well? Well, it's very simple. Their combat systems for Gotham Knights are actually quite solid. The way everything is programmed and coded, the way enemies respond, in my opinion, I feel like it's a 9 out of 10. The reason I give it a 9 out of 10 is because the system is intuitive, but there are little aspects where the combat system itself is very busy, and sometimes things may or may not register in terms of collision. Example is sometimes you want to hit an enemy NPC and the hit does not register. That's an Unreal Engine thing for the most part, but it is still something that you have to deduct points for. Or in some cases, your buttons, your inputs don't necessarily register as well, because that's also kind of an input delay type deal. And that's based on the way the system is kind of configured in a sense. So if you think about like the Arkham games do a lot with very little in a sense. Let me give you an example. You hit a button, that's to attack. The attack can be varied, and that's just the game picking from a library of different animation and attacks based on different scenarios for you to be able to pull off. In Gotham Knights, the pressure that you apply to your attack button, when you apply the pressure, is where you're going to be able to unlock different combos, and then the timing and the sequence within which you apply the pressure. So pretty much what's going on is, you guys understand what I mean, right? So your timed attacks are basically a very cool system, but they're trying to do a lot. And sometimes this could cause, in my opinion, what I call latency issues or input queuing errors that could happen, because this requires some precision overall. So I think with that combat mechanic, it's one that they could probably reiterate, maybe do things slightly differently, give you a 2-button attack. But I also think that there's a side of this conversation that we haven't necessarily had, which is accessibility. The combat system in Gotham Knights, putting your light and heavy attacks on one button, allows for accessibility more than anything else. If somebody was trying to maybe understand and figure out different aspects of the combat, they first have to learn not only attacks, but then they have to learn momentum abilities. So putting the attacks on one button, to me, makes sense to simplify things, because then you have to memorize your momentum abilities, when to use them, how to use them, at what point you can use them for all your different characters. So you're going to memorize your AoEs depending on the character you're using, because every character has different buttons or button combinations. Then you have to design your piercing abilities, your guard break abilities, and so on and so forth. And these are mapped differently for all the different characters, which is another way that makes them play differently. So if you were designing the combat system in that way, it makes sense that you want people to easily know, okay, if it comes down to it, this is where all your attacks are, just this one button. And then if it came down to it, your dodge is this other button. So a solution to a problem, not necessarily one that everybody likes, but one that's actually practical more than anything else. So this is game development. If they were working with one character, like the way the Arkham games work with basically only Batman in one context, and then, the other Knights basically, then you can then map all these different, abilities to different buttons. But then when you're playing with Catwoman, you will realize that she's also mapped slightly differently in regard to her abilities as well. So again, they didn't have to necessarily focus on Catwoman 100%. They just focused on one superhero over multiple games. And so it made it so fluid, made it so easy to be able to get that superhero just right. Gotham Knights focused on 4 characters right out the box. And so getting everything right, to me, is something that I think, for what they did, 9 out of 10, in my opinion, I think that's actually quite solid for all of those different characters, however you go ahead and look at it. Then if you go ahead and look at enemy variety and look at NPC characters and the way they've decided to go ahead and work on their strengths and their weaknesses, I think this was actually a really cool system. In an RPG context, you can benefit from this, making enemy NPCs respond differently to how the character or how the player decides to go about dealing with them. So I think if they built upon that, then they can pretty much flesh out all kinds of different combat mechanics and enemy NPC mechanics in a way that actually does, it allows for consideration, that you don't just go out with one enemy, character in mind, but when you're going to defeat other enemies, you're paying attention to it. Many video games would do it. To what extent they want to do it, it depends on the way the developers and the game designers design their game. In the Arkham games, you have your brute characters, you have your enemy NPCs that could take on different forms. They could have a weapon on them. They could have, a knife on them. You can break the knife. You can disarm the weapon. You can break the shield. And then the grunts that are basically heavies, you have to stun them before you can take them down. Or you can dodge some of the attacks of those ones that have dodgeable attacks and all kinds of stuff. Whereas in Gotham Knights, you have the different enemy attacks that you can pretty much deal with in different ways, or the enemy classes that respond to only specific things. So it all depends on what the game designers want. But seeing how they were able to flesh out different enemy factions and enemy classes within those factions, I think they actually have what it takes in designing those mechanics. Even when you go look at, say, a game like Star Wars Jedi, Survivor, Jedi Fallen Order, you realize that even from the way they started developing the games, they already had subclasses within their enemy classes as well. They have, the humanoid enemy classes. That's basically enemy classes that are like, human beings. And then you have the plant-based, you have the creature-based. Some of them are flying and so on and so forth. These are really cool things that could, that seeing the way they've used those concepts, even in games like Gotham Knights as well, you could already tell that they have these aspects in mind and nailed down. So from a performance and a combat side, I strongly believe that when you ask the questions and looking at who can answer them, because you have a very small pool of developers to actually pick. I hope you know. There are only like 4 devs that will make a Superman game. It's simple. Warner Bros. Is not going to give it out anymore. They're not interested in doing that. The studios that are making, their superhero games seem to be tied up with either a project or two. The only ones that in my mind are free right now are Avalanche. They just released their Hogwarts Legacy PlayStation 4 and Xbox One port, and Gotham Knights, who just released, and Warner Bros. Montreal, who just released Gotham Knights. So that kind of reduces the number to basically 2, because Rocksteady's working on Suicide Squad, Kill the Justice League. We'll see how that goes. And NetherRealms is looking at bringing out their Mortal Kombat 12 game that was spoken about. When you look around, there really aren't many people. So your choices are quite limited. And I think if you looked at who would be able to get the job done, Montreal continues to resonate with me. It could be another studio, but I think it's probably going to be them. Thanks for watching the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section, and I appreciate you guys for watching. Peace out.